But right now, I'm going to bring our scripture reading today from Paul's letter to the Roman church. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. And do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan. I'm on staff here at the church. And to begin, I want to talk a little bit about how our cultural idea of what family is and what family looks like, it really has changed. And it really changed in the last 100 years more than really any time in history. A few years ago, I had heard what I thought was an interesting podcast, but I've told other people about it. They don't think it's that interesting, and now I'm inflicting this upon you. But the podcast was about how home architecture can actually be traced through the last 100 years with the way that kind of family dynamics have changed. And so he started by talking about how if you see homes that are built before the 1940s, really before home AC and heating and air and all that kind of stuff is, you'd have these huge, large front porches and large wraparound porches, and we know why is because people had to be outside in the summer. When it's hot like this and you don't have any AC, you ain't hanging out in a big sweat box. You're going to go outside. And so kids are outside, and everyone, especially in neighborhood kind of settings, all the front porches are facing one another. And the idea is kids are in the street playing, families are sitting on the front porch, and this was your entertainment. But then from the 1950s to homes built in the 1980s, you see this shift to front porches are really replaced with back decks. Everyone starts building bigger back decks because everyone wants to have privacy in their backyard, because suddenly you've got AC, everyone can be inside all the time, right? Kitchens that when you had no AC used to be tiny. You see homes before the 1940s, they were tiny and shoved in the back of the house because nobody was hanging out in the kitchen because it got hot in the kitchen. And now suddenly in homes in the 1950s to the 1980s, you've got bigger kitchens, but certainly bigger dining rooms, bigger living rooms that are all centered around a TV. And that's because once you have TVs, that's where all the family is. Everybody's hanging out. But still, if you have homes built in the 1940s, 1950s, you have multiple children, because families were much bigger, multiple children crammed into bedrooms the size of an airplane bathroom. You got 6 kids all crammed in this tiny little bed. Bedrooms are tiny. Even the kind of master bedrooms are smaller in these houses. Living rooms are bigger. Dining rooms are bigger because everyone's hanging out. But then you see a trend start to change. In the 1990s through the early 2000s, suddenly, when you have everyone's got a personal computer, TVs start getting cheaper, everyone's got cell phones, bedrooms start getting bigger, and you got a lot more of bedrooms. Bedrooms now are the size living rooms used to be. Living rooms shrink down. Almost nobody's got big front porches anymore. Most people don't even have big backyards anymore. Everything starts to shrink because suddenly what ends up happening is everyone is kind of hanging out in their own space. Everyone's got their own bedroom, their own place to kind of hang out. And the reason why, and this is kind of what the podcast went into, is the idea of what we have thought about when we think about family has really shifted from this idea of community to family to the individual. For most of human history, the family unit has been kind of the central unit of society. It was the place where people would share work, life, resources. I'm just talking about for the vast majority, not the last 100 years. For the vast majority of human history, all work was done at home. All family life was done at home. All communal life was kind of done in these areas. Excuse me. And life in the family at this time was primarily about family life. It was about mutual flourishing. You were having kids because, well, you had to have somebody work on the land. You had to have somebody to help you get stuff done. You were training children for life in a family. We needed to learn to care for one another as a necessity of life. But what ends up happening is, as technology changes, as work life changes, as society kind of moves, as you have life expectancy go up, and suddenly people are living into their 80s, 90s, hundreds on a more regular basis, living standards increase. Well, what happens is family life becomes less about the mutual flourishing of the family, and it ends up becoming about individual flourishing. The family is no longer kind of seen as the primary end goal. It is seen as the launching pad for everyone to go off and live their own individual life. So it used to be that kind of starting the family was the marker of adulthood, and now we kind of shift in our mind to the starting of adulthood is establishing a career. It's finding a thing that makes you feel happy and fulfilled and meaningful in your own life. And family time becomes less about practicing working things out and submitting to one another and sacrificing for one another. And it becomes more about we've all got to emotionally support one another as we're all going out and living. As one researcher has now said, the family is about supporting individuals living parallel lives in the same space. We're all living a life, it's just a separate life, and we're all just in the same space. Now, I was a little worried when I wrote this that I would sound like an old man screaming at the sky, but based on the age of the people in this room, I think I'm doing okay. Now, I'm not trying to say there's a right or wrong to any of this. It's not to say that the way things used to be was amazing and everything should go back to there. It's not to say what we're doing now is terrible and we shouldn't do it. What it is to try and get clear is in the last 100 years, we have had a massive shift of what most people think of when you think of family and what families are expected to do for one another. What I'm trying to highlight is when we hear an ancient text like the Bible talk about what it means to be family, we're not thinking of the same thing they were thinking of. Because we're not thinking of the same thing people were thinking of 100 years ago. We have a completely different idea. And we're in a series talking about becoming God's family. We've been saying the church is not just a collection of individual people living parallel lives. We are not just a bunch of people who happen to believe all the same things, and sometimes we all get together, but really our focus is on my life and what I got going on. That the church is intended to be a family. That we are intended to be about mutual flourishing. We are intended to be about one another. And so the idea that most of us have of the family is kind of being the most primary thing is to make sure everyone finds their thing, right? You hear parents now talk about, I just want to make sure my kid finds their thing. What is their thing? And most of us, that's kind of our own thoughts about our own spiritual life is, what is my purpose? What is my meaning? What is my kind of thought about it? What ends up happening is the modern idea of church family ends up being a group of people who share similar beliefs, but we're all just working out my individual relationship with God. And so we end up saying things like this. Well, I come to church because I come to church to learn about God. Or I come to church because I come to learn how to live my life. Or we say, I come to church because I need a spiritual refill before I go out into the world and all those idiots out there wreck my peace. And so I got to come in and get my tank refilled. It's a launching pad. For many of us, the way we talk, it's not much different than the way people talk about going to the gym. It's like I got to go in, it gets my day started right. It gets my week started. I get my mind focused on the right thing. I go in, and I've even made some friends there, and I call them my hashtag gym fam. That's my gym fam. We're all hanging out, but in the end, I don't go to the gym to work out their body. I go out for my health. I show up for my life. And often what ends up happening is church family get shrunken down to church fam. We get shrunken down to, I want a church that's going to fit my lifestyle, that's going to help make my life better, make things more manageable for me. Maybe I'll make some friends, but I'm coming here to work out my relationship with God. But we said this in the first week of this series, we don't gather because of what we get out of it. We don't gather because it's doing something for me. We gather because of Jesus and what he has done, and we gather for one another. We gather because we love Jesus, more accurately, because he first loved us and he gave himself for us. This is why we show up. And in response to that love, and Ed talked about this last week, we gather to worship him. So I don't come and sing because there's an emotional release I kind of get out of that, though that often happens. I don't come and sing because there's some spiritual connection to God that I get out of it. It's because I love him and because he's the one who deserves my praise. And so I show up because that's who he is. When I come and I hear the reading of God's word, as we just heard, when I come and someone teaches from God's word, I'm not doing that simply because it makes my life better and I want to figure out how I can learn something new. It's ultimately because I'm submitting myself to what God says is reality. What God says is how I am to live and what I am to do and to live in obedience to his commands. And so we gather because of Jesus, but we also gather for one another. The book of Hebrews says the reason we should not neglect our meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, it is not because I alone need it, but because we need it. We gather to spur one another on to good deeds. We spur one another on to continue in the faith. We gather to practice life together, which is what we're going to be doing for all eternity. Heaven is not going to be me and God in some kind of private spiritual experience. It is life in the city of God, surrounded by God's family, and he's going to live right in the middle of this. And so we've been saying we need to practice what does family life look like right now, which is nearly what all the New Testament writings from early church leaders are about. They're filled with these commands about one another. It keeps coming up again and again. Love one another, forgive one another, do for one another what Christ has done for you. See, after Jesus' resurrection, he sends out his followers and he tells them, you're to go out and make disciples of all nations. And he says, you baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's saying you initiate them into life in the family, in the kingdom, life with God. And then you teach them to obey everything I have commanded you to do. And so that's what we see in the New Testament every time that the followers of Jesus go out in the book of Acts all over the Roman world. We see the same pattern. They go into a town, they preach the good news that Jesus is king, they baptize believers, and then they gather them into church communities, and not just so that they can keep reminding one another that Jesus is king. It is so they would have the responsibility to one another. We've got to figure out, how do we teach one another to obey everything Jesus commanded us to do? And so we see writings like the one Jason read from Paul's letter to the church in Rome. And we see other writings all over the New Testament that have these long sections that aren't just about Jesus being king. They're filled with these one another commands, which are all about how do I practice the commands of Jesus by learning to forgive one another and to be patient with one another and to honor one another and to serve one another. The idea certainly is that these believers would become people who are just patient as people. That certainly is the idea, that we would want all people to be honoring whether the person is a believer or a non-believer. I would want all the believers to be honoring people in their life, whether that person's a believer or not. And even forgiving enemies, and in this case it was enemies who were persecuting them. But the point of the commands was always that this begins in the family of God, that the family of God is where God's Spirit is working to create a new creation kind of people. A people that had never existed before. A people that still regularly have to be born again and again and again into a new kind of life. But not merely to send out individual disciples to go and live their own parallel lives. He's not just sending them out to go, hey, go make your marriage better, make your kids better, make all of that. That's all going to be a byproduct of this. But that was not the end goal of this. It was that the Spirit was at work within their life together to form them into brothers and sisters, a new family that would last forever.
In the ancient world, siblings' relationships were more important and tightly held than in our own. In fact, some historians even go as far as to say that in terms of loyalty and identity, the sibling relationship outranked most marriage relationships, meaning that even once a person got married, they often still viewed themselves as members of their family of origin rather than being a part of a new nuclear family centered on them and their spouse. In our culture, marriage is often viewed as the ultimate friendship. It's about love and intimacy and romance. It's the closest relationship between two people. This wasn't the case in the ancient world. Though there certainly were ideas about romance and intimacy within marriage, it was usually a result or blessing of the marriage, not the reason to get married. Marriage was seen less as a passionate romance or deep friendship, and more of a social partnership. It was two people building a family, sharing work, and raising children to carry on your family line. You might hope for romance and friendship one day, but it wasn't promised, especially because most people didn't have an expectation of growing old together. Women died in childbirth frequently, or their husbands, who were often 10 to 15 years older than them, would leave them widowed at a young age. And if a widow was left childless, she would be taken in by her brother if she was Roman, or if she was a Hebrew woman, she'd be taken in by her husband's brothers. In the same way, men didn't usually leave their family home when they got married to buy their own property. In Roman law, they usually weren't allowed to own anything until their father passed. So a man would marry a woman and bring her into his father's household. Brothers often remained physically and relationally close, working together throughout their lives. Even after their father died, that bond remained intact. This means maintaining and honoring relationships as brothers and sisters were more than just seeing each other at Thanksgiving once a year. It was a deep and meaningful bond. Families were networks of older siblings caring and protecting and providing for younger siblings, and the younger honoring and submitting to the older. These are not people living parallel lives in the same space. They are deeply tied to one another and share much of their life together. This is why it is so striking and often offensive that Christians began referring to one another as brothers and sisters. This was not only uncommon at the time, but deeply upset the social and moral order of the Roman world. Brother and sister were not merely family titles, but legal terms that carried obligations. So no one called their friends family, but the Christians did. And it went beyond the gross out factor to the Romans of husbands and wives calling each other's brothers and sisters, which was often used as anti-Christian propaganda in times of persecution. It carried a deeper social fear for Roman society. If a wealthy Roman became a Christian and saw his slaves as his brothers and sisters, he would have to treat them differently. What if a Roman senator became a Christian and saw slaves as his brothers and sisters that he had an obligation to? How would that change laws in the social order? Christian family didn't mean showing up for potluck every so often. It meant real financial and social obligations to one another, which is why when the Apostle Paul writes to the Christians living in the Roman world, he gets really clear on what our obligations to one another as brothers and sisters are. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. He calls the church to a deeper form of devotion than just a social or religious gathering. In this phrase, Paul actually uses two different Greek words for love. He first uses Philadelphia, which refers to brotherly love or affection, and also some great cream cheese. Philadelphia is not merely about how we feel about our family, but about the same kind of love that is embodied in our obligations to one another in a legal and financial sense. It's about recognizing one another as brothers and sisters in how we care for one another's needs. But then Paul adds another Greek word, philastorgos, and this is a kind of love that isn't merely about your obligations, but about the warmth and affection of love. It's about cherishing one another. Paul is saying, I want you to not only care for one another out of obligation, but from the heart, which is why in the previous verse, Paul had told them, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Your love must be genuine, not forced. But it could also be said, your love must be genuine, not merely something you feel. Often we want to say we love someone simply because we don't have any ill will towards them. But the kind of love Paul is describing here is a love that goes beyond our feelings. It shows up in our devotion and commitment to one another. A love and devotion that looks like Jesus, who went to the cross out of love and devotion to us.
So now let's look at our scripture for today from the book of Romans and what it means about learning to be family. Many scholars actually believe that though most of us read the book of Romans, find it very confusing at times as this big work of theology, that Paul is primarily writing this to a church that had become pretty divided about how to live as family. In 49 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius had expelled all the Jewish citizens from Rome. There was a big uproar at the time, and so he had kicked out all the Jewish people from Rome, including the Jewish Christians at the time. And so the church in Rome, for about 5 years, was made up entirely of Gentiles. And so when Claudius dies and the Jewish Christians return to Rome, they walk into a church that is not at all of their liking. They do not recognize it. It has been turned completely into Gentile preferences. And so there's this division in the churches in Rome, and it's looking like there might start to be, well, this church over here is for Jewish Christians, and this church over here is for Gentile Christians, in the way that our country's history with slavery and segregation ended up creating, well, there's a white church over here, and there's a black church over here. And so Paul writes the letters to the Romans and says, hey, we can't let this happen. You guys cannot get divided in this way. And so even though all the kind of beautiful theology about the work of Jesus in Rome and about in Romans and about being justified by faith, all of that is an attempt to get Jewish and Gentile Christians to see, hey, you're all the same. All have fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody needs to be justified by faith. Jesus has made you equal, and now you are to live as brothers and sisters in Him. And so when Paul tells them, hey, you are to love one another with brotherly affection. You're to love one another like siblings, which once again, Sierra did a great job of explaining. This is the closest relationship to them. I mean, he is telling them you are to be as close as you can possibly be. This is not easy for this church in Rome. And so he says, your love has to be genuine. It has to be from the heart. But it can't stay in your heart. Often when we say, well, we love everyone always, what we mean is I have no ill will towards anybody. Not that I'm in any kind of relational proximity to anybody to actually love and care for them. And so Paul makes clear this is what it looks like. He says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves, or the translation we used in the video said, outdo one another in showing honor to one another. He is saying to Jewish and Gentile believers, hey, I know you once were enemies. I know you once were hostile to one another. You once considered these other people to be foreigners and to be strange to you. You must now honor them as more important than yourself. You must now treat them like they are an older brother who's to be honored. You're supposed to care for them like a precious younger sister. And he goes on, he goes, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. And this is really what Ed was talking to us about last week. He says, you got to center your life together in worship for Jesus. You will not be able to love people that you once thought were enemies if it's just about, well, I really like the people in my church. Because they're going to offend you. You're going to get hurt. And you're going to have to find ways to draw from a love that is deeper than just what you can do. You're going to have to draw from something deeper, and you're going to have to be rooted in the love of Christ. And in the same way, he says you should be joyful in hope and patient in affliction and faithful in prayer. Now, persecution was an on and off kind of thing in Rome. Sometimes we kind of think Christians were just constantly being persecuted. They weren't just constantly being persecuted, but there was always a threat. If ever there was going to be a time, and there are groups of people in our world that are this way, we're not always going after them, but if there's going to be somebody thrown under the bus, we know who to throw under the bus. That's how it was for Christians. And what he's saying is you got to keep your faith strong together. You got to find ways to spur one another on. You need to stay joyful. You need to be patient when you're going through affliction. You need to be full of hope. And how do we do that? You're faithful in prayer. And not just praying for your needs. You're praying for one another and the needs other people have. He goes on. And you're going to share with the Lord's people in need. And in case that's not clear, he does mean financially. You are going to care for one another. You're going to practice hospitality. That your love cannot just be feelings. They have to show up when somebody has a practical need. Somebody who can meet it should meet it. Somebody should step in and love and help somebody. In the ancient world, under Roman law, brothers and sisters had financial obligations to one another. And what Paul is saying, hey, Christian brothers and sisters under Christ's law have financial obligations to one another. And then Paul paints this picture that really goes beyond obligation. It is this picture of what it looks like to be family. He says, you rejoice with those who rejoice. You mourn with those who mourn. You live in harmony with one another. Don't be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. And these are all rooted really in the same idea here. Paul is saying, I want you to have your lives so entangled with one another that it's about mutual flourishing, not just your flourishing. That you are a family. It's this picture of how you live in harmony with someone else. That when someone else rejoices, you don't have to remind yourself to rejoice. You naturally rejoice. When someone else mourns, it feels like it happens to you, and you feel this. Every parent understands this. When your kid hurts, man, it feels like it's happening to you. And in some ways, and many people, this is why it's tough being the parent of a teenager. Sometimes they hurt themselves, and it hurts you more than it seems to bother them. They get all banged up, and you're like, do you not care what you're doing to me? And they're like, I'm doing it to myself. What are you talking about? Because when you mourn, I mourn. And when something good happens to you, right? I mean, I shared it the week after it happened. Lee and Charlie, who just had a baby, man, when they were having a baby, I was writing this sermon when this was happening. I could not stop thinking about, I wonder what's going on. I wonder what's going on. Because it feels like this is me. This is happening to me, right? Because you're rejoicing. No one has to instruct you to do it when you feel like family. It is the natural outflow of this. But Paul says, you don't just do this for people you naturally like. You got to do this for people you once were enemies with, and people who have wronged you, and people you've been in group with, and they said something that was a little offensive to you, and you're not really sure you want to go back to that group anymore. Someone did something. You're like, I'm not really sure I cared that much about what they did, and I can't do this. No, you got a brotherly affection. That's why he says, you can't be conceited. You can't be so proud. You're not willing to associate with a person in a low position. Now, they lived in an honor-shame society where it was very clear. Think of like the caste system in India. It was clear you're on this level of class. It's not how it works for us. But we say this all the time. You got some of those people. And you say, I can tolerate all kinds of people except for... And then they show up in your small group. Or they sit near you in service. And Paul goes, you got to rejoice when they rejoice. Well, I'm not sure I like what they're rejoicing about. I didn't ask. You got to mourn when they mourn. You got to move towards people in this way because that's your brother. What Paul is envisioning is masters treating their slaves with great honor in Roman society. No one had heard this. This is why the Romans are freaking out. They're like, no one's ever thought of a master treating a slave like a brother or a sister. Paul says you don't get to decide that. He says, rich believers, you're to care for the needs of poor brothers and sisters, but at the same time, your poor brother or sister has spiritual wisdom that you need. And you need, as the rich brother or sister, to submit yourself to them. You're not just doing them a favor, they are doing you a favor. He sees people in our world divided by race and class and political party saying, "Now you're honored here with me. You're my brother. You're my sister. I rejoice when you rejoice. I mourn when you mourn." It is this beautiful vision of life in the family of God that honestly is one that I just consistently return to because it does not happen instantly. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and it takes being intentional. You have to choose it again and again. You have to sacrifice for it. You have to fight to maintain it. You have to give up your comfort to see it happen. You got to move towards strangers to love them like family simply because Christ has already told you that's your brother and that's your sister. And if that is so, you have to be devoted to them in love because you owe it to Christ Jesus. And so for those of us who are living in this kind of church fam kind of world, let's take a moment to look closer at the instructions here of Paul. I mean, do you have relationships in this church where you are regularly honoring other people, especially people you are not naturally tempted to honor? You're pretty tempted to dishonor them. Would you honor that person? Are you close enough to anyone's life that when they rejoice, it would naturally make you rejoice? And when they mourn, it tears up your stomach. You feel it. You have to mourn with them. Are there any people you've taken care of needs for recently? Are there anyone who depends on you to be at church and when you don't show up, they don't only notice, they missed it. They felt like we were less than because you weren't here today. Are there anyone you're carrying in prayer? Anyone you regularly call to check on? Do I only have relationships with people who look like me and think like me and vote like me? Or are there people to me, close enough to me now as family, that if it weren't for Jesus, I probably would not associate with that person? Because the only way to grow in love, the only way to really know you love and that you have grown into the love of Christ is you got to get some unlovable people around you to practice on. And I say it all the time, we got no lack of supply of unlovable people at Community Christian. This is why we have to grow beyond this modern kind of American church idea of church fam. I mean, this individualized, consumer-minded, what am I getting out of this situation church idea? Because family is not something you get anything out of. Mostly family are people that you got stuck with and you got obligations to. Family is not convenient. It takes being intentional. It takes prioritizing one another over other people. My family grew up, we grew up eating at the dinner table every day together, but then as naturally happens, everyone starts getting jobs, right? Everyone starts doing other stuff, and so we can't all get together at lunch, but we started saying, okay, every Saturday lunch, that's family lunch. You don't schedule work on that day. You don't do things with your friends on that day. Everyone's showing up. And it eventually got to the point of if you're hanging out with your friends can come too, but you better be at Saturday lunch. Why? Because you're family. And the way you show one another that we love one another is you sacrifice your convenience. You sacrifice other obligations. You say, this matters more. And see, nothing... Even when I don't get anything out of it, especially when I don't get anything out of it, especially when it's difficult for me, especially when there's something else I might rather be doing, it says something when I show up for you. And see, it's not in the giving, in the serving, in the sacrificing, you actually receive something greater even when you don't get something out of it in the moment. As we already read from 1 John, he says, you must love one another because Christ first has loved you by giving his life for you. But then John promises us this. He says, no one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, and notice that's an if. If we love one another, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. If we love one another, his love will be made complete in us. What does that mean? There is an incomplete way his love shows up if I refuse to love you. There is a way I will not completely experience God living in me if I do not love you. Church fam allows me to think as long as my personal relationship with God is going good, then loving my brothers and sisters is secondary. John makes clear you can't even really see God. You can't really have God live in you or have his love made complete in you if you are not willing to love one another as family. So you must love one another. Gathering as a church family, it is an essential way that we love and we honor Jesus. The idea that the church exists to help you in your relationship with God is rooted in the idea that I am the purpose of my life. You are not the purpose of your life, and I am not the purpose of my life. Christ is the purpose of everything. Christ is the center of everything. Because what Jesus is doing in human history is not merely saving individual souls to go to heaven with him. He is gathering together an entire people that want to spend eternity with him. And in the end, God will return to reclaim his church. He will come back, but he is not just coming back for me. And he is not just coming back for you. He is coming back for us. Jesus, in case you did not know, Jesus is not a polygamist. He's only got one bride. He doesn't have a bunch of little individual brides sitting around. He doesn't got a whole bunch of little bodies sitting around. He has a bride, and he has a body, and it's not me, and it's not you. It is us. He's coming back for us. And certainly that means all believers throughout history and around the world. But Christ has put me in this place, in this time in history, to love these specific people in the way that Paul has described to us. Because this is what I'll be doing for all eternity, and I'm no good at it. I got to practice it. Because I tend to love, and I tend to serve, and I tend to prioritize the people who are easy for me to love. But Jesus already made clear, that's not even love. If you only love those who love you, if you only love those who are easy for you to love, well, that's no different than everybody else. But Christ expects me to not only be devoted to the family I was born into, the family I have legal obligations to, he expects me to be devoted to you and to honor you and to serve you and to meet your needs simply because you just happen to show up here. You happen to be here. And you chose to be part of this church family. And he also instructs that I have to do that from a place of genuine love, which means that's not a thing I can make myself do. It is not a thing I can force to happen. But what I can do is I can prioritize being with you. And I can put myself in places like on a small group or in a team where I could know you and I could know your family and I could know what's going on in your life. And then I could begin to pray for you. And I could begin to show up for you. And I could begin to trust that if I do what God has called me to do, he will knit our hearts together in love. And then we might actually see each other as brothers and sisters because that's what God's already made us. So this summer, we're going to be focusing on some opportunities to spend time together like brothers and sisters. Jason's going to come and lead us in considering what our next step is in this.